Hydrogen is dead. That's what everyone believes right now. Every headline from the last few years told the same story. Hydrogen cars failed, hydrogen stations shut down, and the future belongs to batteries. But here's the question nobody in the mainstream conversation is asking. If hydrogen is really dead, why are the United States military, heavy industry, and freight transportation companies quietly pouring billions of dollars into it? Why would the Navy fund a program capable of producing hydrogen aboard ships and on shore at a rate of more than 20 kilograms per day, compressed to 350 bar, if the technology behind it was already a corpse? That contradiction is the reason we're making this documentary, because somewhere between the failure everyone saw and the investment nobody is talking about, there is a much bigger story hiding in plain sight. For most people, hydrogen's story ends with a parking lot. Somewhere in California, there's a Toyota Mirai sitting next to a fueling station that might or might not be working that day. That image, more than any spreadsheet or press release, is what killed hydrogen in the public imagination. The idea was elegant on paper: fill up in minutes, drive for hundreds of miles, and the only thing coming out of your tailpipe is water. But elegant ideas do not survive contact with infrastructure economics. By 2024, the United States had only 54 open retail hydrogen stations in the entire country, and almost all of them were clustered in California, with a single outlier in Hawaii. Compare that to the tens of thousands of gas stations and the rapidly expanding network of electric chargers, and you start to understand why hydrogen cars never had a real chance to become a mainstream product. Honda pulled the plug on its Clarity model in 2021, quietly winding down production while continuing limited leases. Hyundai kept the Nexo alive in South Korea and California, proving hydrogen passenger cars hadn't vanished completely, but never approaching the sales volume of battery electric vehicles. Toyota, to its credit, never abandoned the technology, but even Toyota began shifting its hydrogen ambitions away from ordinary consumers and toward commercial and heavy-duty vehicles. The lesson underneath all of this wasn't that hydrogen doesn't work. It was that hydrogen cars ask customers to solve an infrastructure problem that should have belonged to an entire industry, not to a single buyer standing next to an empty tank. Here's the part almost nobody explains properly. Passenger cars were never hydrogen's best use case. They were simply the most visible one. Think about the fundamental physics for a second. Hydrogen has to be produced, usually through electrolysis powered by electricity. Then it has to be compressed or cooled into a liquid, transported, stored, and finally converted back into electricity inside a fuel cell before it can turn a wheel. Every single one of those steps loses energy. A battery electric vehicle skips almost all of that, taking electricity straight from a wall outlet to a battery to a motor. For a private car driven by one person who values simplicity and low running costs, that efficiency gap matters enormously. But flip the scenario. Imagine a vehicle that doesn't care about convenience for a single owner. Imagine a vehicle that needs to run for hours without making a sound, without generating heat that a sensor can detect, and without needing anyone nearby to refuel it. Suddenly, the weaknesses of hydrogen, the complexity, the specialized handling, the need for dedicated infrastructure start to look a lot less important, because the mission itself justifies the cost. That is exactly the environment the United States military operates in, and it's exactly why the Navy has been experimenting with hydrogen fuel cells for years, largely outside the public spotlight. This is where the story gets interesting, because the Navy isn't chasing hydrogen for environmental reasons. It's chasing it for operational advantages that have nothing to do with saving the planet and everything to do with staying hidden. Fuel cells have very few moving parts compared to a diesel generator, which means they run quieter. They produce less waste heat, which means they're harder to detect with thermal sensors. For an unmanned underwater vehicle trying to avoid detection, or a portable generator powering a remote outpost, silence and a low thermal signature aren't luxuries. They're survival advantages. The clearest example of how far this has gone is a program called Expeditionary Hydrogen on Ship and Shore, known as EHOSS, awarded to Pratt Miller in 2025 by the Defense Innovation Unit. This isn't just a fuel cell bolted onto a drone. It's an entire miniature hydrogen supply chain designed to generate, compress, store, and dispense hydrogen directly aboard ships or on shore installations. The system is built to produce more than 20 kilograms of hydrogen per day at 350 bar of pressure. To put that in human terms, imagine carrying a portable factory small enough to fit on a ship, capable of manufacturing its own fuel on demand, without waiting for a supply convoy to arrive. That single detail, a self-contained hydrogen factory riding along with the fleet, is the golden fact hiding behind this entire story, because it reframes hydrogen not as a fuel people buy at a station, but as a capability the military can carry with it into contested territory. The Navy has also funded testing of something called the Subsea Supercharger, a hydrogen fuel cell power and charging station built by Teledyne, designed to recharge autonomous underwater vehicles without forcing them to return to a mothership or surface base. Earlier research went even further, demonstrating a fuel cell-powered unmanned aircraft launched from a submerged submarine, with an endurance exceeding 6 hours. None of this replaces the nuclear reactors powering America's submarines or the conventional propulsion systems driving its surface fleet. This is not a story about the Navy converting aircraft carriers to hydrogen power. It's a story about small, unmanned expeditionary systems finding real, measurable advantages in a technology that consumers rejected for completely different reasons. So why does this matter to industries far outside the military? Because the same logic that makes hydrogen valuable to the Navy applies almost perfectly to heavy transportation and manufacturing. A private car owner cares about convenience, resale value, and daily running costs. A trucking company running a fleet along fixed freight corridors cares about something completely different: uptime and payload. A heavy truck that can refuel in minutes and carry more cargo because it isn't dragging around an enormous battery pack starts to look economically attractive, especially on long-haul routes where every extra minute of charging time translates directly into lost revenue. Railroads face a similar calculation on routes that were never electrified and where installing overhead power lines would cost a fortune. Ports, with their centralized, predictable operations, can justify building a single hydrogen fueling station that serves an entire fleet of vehicles, completely sidestepping the chicken and egg infrastructure problem that killed hydrogen passenger cars. Steel manufacturing offers one of the most surprising applications of all. Traditional steelmaking relies on coal-derived gas to strip oxygen away from iron ore. Hydrogen can perform that same chemical function without the associated carbon emissions, and several early commercial projects are already testing this exact substitution. None of this is happening because engineers suddenly fell back in love with hydrogen. It's happening because these industries have use cases where hydrogen's weaknesses, cost, complexity, and infrastructure requirements matter far less than they do to an individual driver trying to get to work every morning. Now let's talk about batteries, because this documentary isn't here to convince you that hydrogen is secretly better than lithium-ion technology. It isn't, at least not for passenger vehicles. Batteries dominate cars for a simple, boring, extremely important reason: efficiency and convenience. You plug your car into an outlet at home, electricity flows almost directly into your battery, and you drive away the next morning without ever thinking about hydrogen compression, cryogenic storage, or specialized refueling infrastructure. For the vast majority of daily driving, nothing about hydrogen improves that experience. It only adds cost and complexity. But batteries have their own physical limitations, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Battery weight scales up dramatically as you try to extend range or increase payload capacity, which becomes a serious problem for heavy trucks, ships, and aircraft. Charging times, even with the fastest available technology, still take longer than filling a hydrogen tank, which matters enormously for vehicles that generate revenue only when they're moving. And for military and industrial applications requiring long-duration energy storage, backup power during grid failures, or operation completely disconnected from an electrical grid, hydrogen offers a kind of flexibility that batteries simply cannot match today. This is the central truth underneath everything we've covered so far. Hydrogen and batteries were never actually competing for the same job. They only appeared to compete because the public conversation was almost entirely focused on passenger cars, the one application where batteries had an overwhelming structural advantage from the very beginning. Zoom out from individual companies and vehicles, and you start to see something much bigger taking shape. A genuine global competition over hydrogen infrastructure, and it's happening at a national level. China currently leads the world in electrolyzer manufacturing and deployment scale, accounting for roughly half of global spending on electrolysis projects in 2023 alone, while simultaneously driving massive growth in heavy fuel cell trucks and buses. Europe has built the most comprehensive policy framework, focused heavily on industrial decarbonization, hydrogen-based steel production, and cross-border hydrogen import corridors, accounting for roughly 1/3 of global electrolysis investment. The United States, meanwhile, is leaning heavily on public funding and defense research, committing $7 billion to 7 regional clean hydrogen hubs under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, projects the Department of Energy expects to eventually support around 3 million tons of annual hydrogen production. Japan and South Korea round out the competition, treating hydrogen less as a consumer product and more as a matter of national energy security, given how heavily both countries depend on imported energy. Here's the question worth sitting with for for a moment. If 4 of the world's largest economies are competing over hydrogen infrastructure at a national level, is it really accurate to call this a failed technology? Or did we simply misunderstand which market it was ever supposed to win? Because that's really what this entire investigation reveals. Hydrogen wasn't rejected everywhere. It was rejected specifically in the one market where efficiency and everyday convenience mattered more than anything else: the private passenger car. In practically every other market we've discussed today, unmanned military systems, heavy freight, railroads, ports, steel manufacturing, long-duration energy storage, hydrogen isn't failing at all. It's quietly becoming industrial strategy, backed by defense budgets, national energy policy, and heavy industry, rather than by ordinary consumers standing at a fueling pump waiting for the next hydrogen delivery truck to show up. Understand this clearly. This is not a story about hydrogen replacing batteries, and anyone who tells you it is misunderstands the underlying physics as badly as the industry misjudged the passenger car market a decade ago. This is a story about 2 different technologies solving 2 fundamentally different sets of problems. Batteries win when efficiency, daily convenience, and simplicity matter most. Hydrogen wins when endurance, payload, refueling speed, or complete independence from a power grid matter more than raw efficiency. The mistake the entire industry made was trying to force hydrogen into a market that never actually needed those particular strengths. So the next time you see a headline declaring hydrogen dead, remember what's actually happening far away from those consumer headlines. Remember a self-contained hydrogen factory small enough to ride along with a Navy fleet, quietly producing more than 20 kilograms of fuel per day for systems specifically designed to operate in silence. Remember heavy trucks moving freight across the country without the payload penalty of a massive battery pack. Remember steel plants testing hydrogen as a replacement for coal-derived gas. None of that made headlines the way a failed car company did, but all of it represents real money, real engineering, and real strategic commitment from some of the most powerful institutions on the planet. Hydrogen didn't lose. It simply found the industries where its advantages actually matter, far away from the consumer spotlight that once declared it dead. And that raises one final question worth leaving you with tonight. If the biggest energy stories are increasingly happening away from consumer headlines, in military labs, shipping ports, and steel plants, what other technologies are we currently writing obituaries for, simply because we're only watching the wrong market? To make sure you're never the last one to know what's actually happening under the hood of the industry, both literally and geopolitically, join us here at Driven to Distraction, because the next headline you dismiss might be the one that changes everything.